All right, Algebra 1, Unit 6 students, this is the video for Lesson 1. I've already taken the opportunity to make a little diagram summarizing what you see in the lesson for, or in the text for Lesson 1. So kind of summarize things for you to kind of give you just a little bit of a shorter view of that information so you don't have to go through all of the text. The main concept that you are wanting to get out of this lesson is going to be the difference between quadratic and linear functions. Unit 6 is all about quadratic functions. And so hopefully linear functions are something that's familiar to you, you're at least aware of, because we're going to be looking at the differences between these two types of functions. And so I'm just going to take us through this diagram, which is basically what is in Lesson 1. And all of the questions are basically asking you to determine if a characteristic is a characteristic of a quadratic function or a linear function. And so it might give you a graph and then say, is this graph look like a quadratic or linear function? It might give you a description of whether it's a parabola or a straight line. And in every case, you're just identifying whether it's a linear or quadratic function. So I'm just going to take us down this diagram and talk about each one. So I'm actually going to start over here with linear. So a linear function is a function that graphs a straight line. So you can see that word line is in the name of linear functions. And so it's going to graph a straight line function. And the formula for that is mx plus b. Usually you see a y there, so y equals mx plus b, but the basic structure of the equation is mx plus b. You'll notice there's just an x, and it doesn't have an exponent or a power or anything. And m and b would be constants. They would be some number, 3 or 8 or whatever. The other way it could be written is ax plus b, just so you're aware. So obviously this is what we would say is just a kind of generic graph of a linear function. It forms a straight line. And then when we talk about the values of that function, the x value changes result in a constant change in the y values. In other words, when I go up 1 on the y, it's over 1 on the x. Over 1, up 1, over 1, up 1. And it doesn't change at any point. The change is constant. The change is constant. So it's changing the same amount each time. So that's linear functions right there. So when we talk about quadratic functions, we're talking about a function that forms what we call a parabola. Okay, that's what this term is, parabola. It refers to this shape of the graph. It can be like this. It can also open downward, but this is kind of just a generic graph of that. This formula here is the generic formula for quadratic functions. You notice there's an x squared and an x, and then a constant term over here. So just be aware of that. That's the type of equation that you're looking for when you see a quadratic function. I already mentioned this, but the name for the graph is a parabola. And then there are kind of two pieces of information about this type of function. One, the changes in the x values result in y values that decrease and then increase. Notice there's a change, whereas over here it was just going the same. With quadratic functions, first my y values are decreasing, and then they change and they start increasing. Additionally, they're different. The difference between this point and this point is different between this point and this point, this point, this point. So you notice it changes different values as you move across the graph. The change here is much more than the change here. It's changing a lot where it's only changing a little here. And then also there's this idea of the second difference. And all you need to know about that is that what is constant about the y values is the difference between each y value is constant. So if I were to compare the y values here, 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 the change in the y values would be constant. But that term right there, that phrase is the phrase you're going to see in the text. And in the lesson, there will be a question about the second difference being constant. And that is always going to refer to quadratic functions. So that's it for lesson one.